Hi, I am so honored to be here with one of my biggest idols, who I think is unbelievably brilliant, Dr. Datis Kharrazian. He is an award-winning researcher, clinician, author, educator with more than 20 years of experience using functional medicine to treat highly complex patient cases. Dr. Kharrazian is a faculty member for the Institute of Functional Medicine, an associate clinical professor at Loma Linda University School of Medicine, and on the scientific editorial board for the Journal of Functional Neurology, Rehabilitation and Ergonomics, and Alternative Medicine Therapies in Health and Medicine. He specializes in developing evidence-based models to treat autoimmune, neurological, and unidentified chronic diseases using non-pharmaceutical applications such as diet, nutrition, and lifestyle medicine. His academic and clinical research has been featured in numerous documentaries, and his clinical models of functional medicine are used by several academic institutions and thousands of healthcare providers throughout the world. That's his official bio, but I want to add to that he also has written two amazing best-selling books, one about the thyroid that I think really revolutionized how people looked at the thyroid and looked at autoimmunity, and also one on the brain. And he's one of the first, he's both a clinician and a researcher, so he's actually treating clients and seeing what is moving the needle for brain inflammation. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Jodi.
Thank you. And if you could just talk a little bit about how you, your path towards functional neurology and the brain, how you started that focus.
Well, I was growing up and I had a sick family member, and I was a member going to all the different medical appointments with them, and I didn't know anything about healthcare because I was just a kid, in elementary school and then middle school and then high school. And then the only person that ever made a difference for her was a chiropractor in a small little office doing nutrition. And at that time, functional medicine wasn't even around, but just to see what an impact clinical nutrition can do with a chronic disease was mind-blowing for everyone in our family, including myself. And then over the years, just to see how supporting the brain came in, and then autoimmunity was a factor. So I think just when it came to the point in your life, like, what do you want to do? And I thought, well, maybe I want to do that because that seemed pretty cool. And so that's kind of what got me there, is just to see the impact and how powerful, how therapies can be that are looking at lifestyle and nutrition. And then eventually this translated into something we call functional medicine now. And been, with that community since it started, and I'm really loving it. So it's just, I think it was just like most people, they have something in their life that dramatically impacts them, and then they get interested and excited about it.
I'm so glad. I mean, I'm sorry that you had to go through that as a child, but I'm so glad you chose this because you're making such an impact. And one of the things I want to talk about, you really focus on brain inflammation, which needs to be talked about more, because so many people, some of the symptoms, people just say like, oh, you're fine. Oh, you're just getting old. Oh, you need antidepressants. So can you talk about how some of the symptoms of brain inflammation might present?
Sure. So brain inflammation is really very common. We're all used to seeing inflammation throughout our body, but inflammation in the brain is, first of all, very unique than the rest of the body. But the main symptoms of brain inflammation are really slower mental speed. So you can't focus, you can't concentrate, what people call brain fog, because inflammation reduces nerve conductive speed. And then the other key thing is just depression. So we see people that have lots of depression, can't focus, can't concentrate, and as their brain gets inflamed, they also lose their brain endurance. So their energy level, the capacity to handle doing things for longer periods of time all become a factor. So the typical patient that has brain inflammation is just fatigued, depressed, can't focus, can't concentrate, and can't do activities they used to do for as long as they used to do them, like reading or driving or things like that. So that's the neuroinflamed patient.
And can you talk a little bit, one of the terms that you use is glial cell priming, and glial cells are brain cells. What are some of the things that you believe kind of lead to brain inflammation or set people up to kind of tip into illness in the brain?
So there's 4 different pathways that we know about that cause brain inflammation, and they involve, and these are 4 pathways with the blood-brain barrier intact, so you can say there's 5 pathways if the blood-brain barrier breaks down. But we're getting information constantly from our gut to our brain through the vagus. This is called the brain-gut axis, gut-brain axis. There's been an explosion of research in that in the past few years, and they're finding that diseases like Parkinson's disease and even dementia may actually start in the gut from an inflammatory cascade and then cause brain inflammation, which is very fascinating. And then there's just the pathways through what they call active and passive diffusion, where different inflammatory chemicals can cross the brain. But then the worst scenario is if the blood-brain barrier, which is the barrier we have to keep things out of our brain, breaks. And then, we know about leaky gut, but there's now leaky blood-brain barriers.
Yeah.
And when the blood-brain barrier breaks, the brain's really in trouble. That means,
And that's why brain injuries are so damaging, because that's one of trauma can damage.
So when the brain has a traumatic impact on it, several things happen. And one of them is that the blood-brain barrier breaks down. And some studies have shown within the first 2 hours, the blood-brain barrier is broken down, and then the gut barrier breaks down. And then you have this inflammatory cascade. And the blood-brain barrier breaks down in severe inflammation in the brain because it allows T cells to recruit in. And the blood-brain barrier breakdown isn't all from injury. It's actually a cellular response. But if someone already has pre-existing inflammation or pre-existing immune dysregulation from autoimmunity, and then they get a head injury, it's a completely different response, because now the blood-brain barrier has become open as a protective mechanism to bring T cells into the brain that don't usually exist there. So you'll see, sometimes someone has a traumatic brain injury and they feel fine, and then 5 or 10 years later, they're not the same. And they don't associate that initial traumatic brain injury was the cause. And there's been a lot of research now, they call it CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy being brain inflammation. So they get a brain injury, and what they realize is that the major effects of it are not after the injury. You recover, you get you get dizzy and feel off for a few days, but then that causes a cascade in the brain that can be permanent. And this is what they call priming, that these cells in the brain called glial cells, which are immune cells, they actually change their structure. Just like a hard-boiled egg can never go back, these glial cells, once they get primed, can never go back. Now there's this ongoing inflammatory state, and then the brain starts to degenerate. And then during that process, the inflammation keeps adding up and adding up and adding up like a forest fire. So a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, 4 years later, they have this progressive inflammatory state. And now they're getting to the point where the inflammation is so great, they can't think, they can't focus, they can't concentrate. And they're really puzzled because they're not linking that initial head trauma may have caused it, because it was so many years ago. But that's what we see. And that's what we're seeing with the NFL players now reporting it. This is what we're seeing with soldiers that have been in Iraq that have had blast injuries. They're having these effects. And because of those high-profile groups of people, soldiers and football players, there's been an explosion of research, and our entire model of brain inflammation has changed because of these new understandings.
And do you believe there's a negative synergy between like toxins or infections or stress, mold, EMF, that if your cells are primed and then you add another stressor, it makes it harder to navigate?
Sure. So for me as a clinician, and the way I teach it to practitioners is so they can use the clinical model we're using for their own practices. We see when a patient comes in and you suspect they have neuroinflammation, so if they come in, they have focus issues, concentration issues, depression, brain fog, you have to kind of put them on a scale of where they are. So one type of inflammation is the less concern. The subtle one is just transient. Inflammation comes and goes. So they may have a reaction to a food protein, and that kind of causes stomach inflammation. The brain gets inflamed from that. Maybe they're sensitive to gluten. They get exposed to gluten, and now they get brain fog for a few days, and then they are fine. Or they may be exposed to an environmental chemical, and then they get exposed to that chemical, and then it causes the brain fog for a few hours or a day, and they go, that's transient. So that's one type.
It's acute. It happens and that passes.
Yeah, okay, right. So that's not too big of a deal. It's something I think most people have experienced at some point in their life. And then the next level is chronic, where people just have chronic brain fog, depression, and that means that clinically that there's an ongoing inflammatory mechanism that's causing it. Someone has celiac disease and they continue gluten, for example. Or someone has an autoimmune disease, and that chronic autoimmune disease, or that inflammatory bowel disease, and inflammatory bowel disease keeps causing brain inflammation. So that's a chronic pattern. And then the third level of progression into the neuroinflammatory scale is someone who now has primed glial cells. And primed glial cells means the inflammatory reaction against the brain was so intense that the cells called glia have now changed their structure. And now they're like active, constant soldiers for the rest of the person's life. And the most common cause of that is traumatic brain injury. But any type of infection can do it. You can have a viral infection that gets into the brain, for example, that can cause glial cell priming.
Right, like Lyme and...
Right, like Lyme disease, and
yeah.
Even certain viruses can cross the blood-brain barrier. Sometimes, people get even bacterial infections, and they do have meningitis, that still exists, and things like that can prime glial cells. But once these glial cells get primed, they're forever changed. But that's like the third level of the intensity. And the fourth level of the scale of the neuroinflammatory intensities is now they turn into brain autoimmunity. So now the immune system is made antibodies against the brain itself, and then there's an active destructive response against the brain when there's an inflammatory cascade. So in a clinical setting, when you see a patient come in and they report, I have fatigue, I have depression, I can't focus, I can't concentrate, we're trying to figure out where on the scale that they're at. Is it just transient? Is it chronic? Or is it primed? Or is this really neurological autoimmunity? And the key difference between primed glial cells, let's say, than someone that has like a chronic or transient inflammation, is when people have primed glial cells, their brain function completely shuts down, meaning like a stress response can impact all of us. We get stressed, we may have not the best sleep, we may have our blood pressure go up, might have anxiety throughout the day, and that's pretty normal for everyone when they're stressed. But if you have primed glial cells, you may completely lose your brain function. Like you may not be able to get out of bed when you're under a stressful response, because the stress response activates these glial cells. People that have primed glial cells, if they get exposed to a chemical, they could be in bed for days. Whereas someone who doesn't have primed glial cells, they get exposed and get a little bit of brain fog. So there's
right. It destroys our resilience.
Right. So these glial cell priming, and you can't have autoimmunity in the brain even without glial cell priming. So you have a mixture of those variations. But there are a lot of chronic patients out there that have neuroinflammation that no one's looking at, and then let's say they have chronic depression, and they're trying every antidepressant, and it doesn't work. And in the literature, what's really popular now in the clinical research with depression is the inflammatory model of depression. They call it the cytokine model of depression, and is unresponsive to antidepressants. So you have some of those patients suffering out there. You have a lot of patients that have chronic fatigue syndrome that are just tired and exhausted all the time, but they're tired and exhausted because the brain doesn't have endurance. So
right, or multi-chemical sensitivity or fibromyalgia.
Exactly.
So here's the exciting turning point. What do you do? How do you help these people?
So you have to create a clinical model, and it has to,
done.
which is we've worked through.
Yeah.
But it's a personal lifestyle model because it's not the same for everyone.
Right.
So at the end of the day, there's only so many interventions we can do. So we always start with lifestyle, diet, nutrition. So there's lots of triggers for people that have these things. We want to identify those triggers first. And starting with lifestyle, I mean, the most obvious ones, you have to sleep. If you don't sleep and you have brain inflammation, you can't recover. Stress response have to be kept under control. Blood sugar spikes and surges, turn those things on. So those are the basic like lifestyle factors. And exercise has been shown to dampen it, but too much exercise has been shown to inflame it. So you can kind of work with finding balance between those things. That's critical.
Yeah.
And someone could have chronic depression, and until they do that, their depression will go away despite any antidepressants they take.
Right. So exercise moves oxygen to the brain, which is good. Blood sugar gives you the optimal amount of glucose in the brain. Sleep helps the lymphatic system so you can detoxify. All these things are just doing what you can to balance. Is there any way to turn off inflammation once it starts in the brain?
Yeah, of course. So there's also nutraceuticals. So then once you go through diet, so once you go through lifestyle, then you can go into diet nutrition, and there's different dietary and dietary protocols that have been published on neuroinflammation. Some as simple as maybe just being gluten-free, and more complex to things like ketosis or fasting. Those things can have an impact on neuroinflammation. Some new papers have just come out that shows actually ketones dampen brain inflammation, that it's not just another fuel source. So you kind of take a patient to the spectrum of intense the inflammation is, what type of dietary changes is. For some people, it's just getting off inflammatory foods. For other people, they have to get off and be gluten-free. For other people, they have to completely go into ketosis and do intermittent fasting. It really depends on the scale of the inflammatory response and what they need to make that change. So that's where diet comes in. And then as far as nutraceuticals, there's a whole list of nutraceuticals that have been shown to dampen brain inflammation, different types of flavonoids. So flavonoids only work if they can cross the blood-brain barrier. So there's about 20 flavonoids that have been published that can cross the blood-brain barrier through passive diffusion. And there's also some research that's been shown that various nutraceuticals, things like short-chain fatty acids and butyrate, turn on pathways in the gut that then reduce inflammation in the brain. And they've been used in animal models of autoimmune disease and inflammatory reactions. So then you can put a person on a cocktail of different, so once you go through lifestyle and you go through dietary changes and you go in through a list of nutraceuticals, you try to dampen their inflammation. And that's what I call still all level 1 care. It's very basic. And then level 2 care is you dig deeper as a clinician and go, what are the triggers? This is where systems biology approach comes in. So this is where we do blood work. Are the complement proteins high, C3, C4, C5? That means there's an active immune infection or immune response. Do they have high HbA1c? Do they have high ferritin, have a Fenton reaction? Do they have S100B protein markers? Is the blood-brain barrier broken down? So this is the model that I teach, and it's it's hard to kind of summarize it in a Skype talk, but that's the next level.
Right.
So there are some patients that just need a very basic lifestyle change.
Right. Like, well, I think your first level helps everyone, and maybe for 50% of your people, it's enough, and then the next 50% need to go to the next level.
Right. So I formed the Kharrazian Institute recently, and the first course we're putting together is on neuroinflammation. And the reason I want to do this course first was because it's such an overlooked area in healthcare.
Completely.
And people that are practitioners really need to understand the scale of it and the management of it, and where level 1 care gets you and where level 2 care gets you, and understand what's been published on it, because there's a tremendous amount of information published on this topic.
Yes.
With diet, nutrition, lifestyle. And so that's one of my initial goals, is to get that information out. And then I like, where I wrote a book on the brain, and we talk about neuroinflammation as a chapter, some subtle things in there people can try. That's one option to help people.
Right. And, one of the things that I do, I have an oil that helps to trigger the vagus nerve to turn on the parasympathetic response, because parasympathetic is related to inflammation. I know you kind of pioneered that. You were really the first one to start talking about vagal tone and vagal activation. Is that something that you integrate into your protocol?
It really depends on so that's where the level 2 comes in, and the individualized, personalized approach. So we always suspect vagal issues if we see loss of vagal function. So loss of vagal function, we can see in an exam. If we have someone move their palate, so when you go into your doctor, they go, ah, and then the palate should move. If those palates aren't moving, we know the parasympathetic systems aren't firing. They don't have a gag reflex, so the gag reflex is abnormal. We know that's there. We're listening to the gut. If the gut's not moving, we don't hear motility. We know that whole vagus system is down. If we see those exam findings with symptoms of constipation and poor digestion, and then we know that whole vagus pattern is down. And so that's when I've always taught then activating the vagus with things like gargling and trying to improve that pathway.
Yes.
So for some people, that could be a factor for them. Like their vagal response is down, so they can't get their gut function to work, and they can't get blood flow to the gut. They can't heal the gut, and that's causing brain inflammation. So for one patient, you may have to go through the whole vagal response pathway, improve that integration to help with their brain inflammation. But for someone else, like, that's totally fine. And they're pre-diabetic, and their HbA1c is really, really high, and they've had a past head injury, and those two combinations is now causing chronic depression for them. So now you got to control their diabetes and repair their blood-brain barrier, and then put them on a bunch of anti-inflammatory things and get their insulin under control, and all of a sudden the brain inflammation goes away.
Yeah, and for the clinicians that are listening, Dr. Kharrazian is offering an amazing neuroinflammation deep dive. It's May 18th and 19th in San Diego, and where he's really going to go into this. One of the things I heard you on a seminar, and someone asked you, this person has this theory, what's your theory? And you said, well, it really depends on the patient, because I think you're right. There are kind of maybe 15 things that could be wrong with different people, and they're going to present differently, and you really need to address what's going on with the individual person. One of the other questions that I've wondered about, sleep. You talked about how sleep is critical, which that's when the lymphatic system turns on. And one of the things that I've noticed in a lot of clients is, astrocytes or glial cells, and they're related to the lymphatic system. And sometimes the aquaporin 4 channels are kind of turned off. Have you found a way to turn that back on, or to kind of balance that?
The aquaporin receptors water channel proteins, and they're involved in the blood-brain barrier. There's a lot of various research other than just blood-brain barrier integrity on them that study that specifically. I mean, there's some research on neuromyelitis optica, which is an autoimmune target site. We published some research on cross-reactivity with food proteins with aquaporin 4 receptors, and I think Journal of Autoimmune Disease, where we published it. So we know some foods cross-react with it. So if we do see people that have aquaporin 4 antibodies, we do get them off the cross-reactive foods.
What are those cross-reactive foods?
It's corn, soy, spinach, tomato. They have
Oh,
almost amino acid structural similarity. So if you have antibodies to those and you eat them, you get specific targeting and binding of those food proteins with the aquaporin 4, which can cause blood-brain permeability. And we did a study where we did the cross-reactivity, and then we took a group of patients that had neuromyelitis optica and a control group, and we looked at the levels between them, and we found a huge, huge difference. So I think if you Google my name with autoimmune disease or neuromyelitis optica, that paper will come up, but we kind of summarize the whole concept there.
that's great.
But that's one thing. But for the most part, yeah, you can get really specific with things, but sleep has a major impact in lots of different ways. And we do have a circadian rhythm even within our neurons, and astroglial cells have their own circadian rhythm, and they have different types of growth factors and hormones that only get released when we're sleeping. And we have, so it's a key factor. I mean, if a person can't sleep well, it's going to be very difficult to bring down brain inflammation. No matter what supplements a person takes or what else, other strategies they use. So it actually is one of our top priorities and when we work up a patient. So we wouldn't put someone on a cocktail of flavonoids if they're not sleeping. We have to figure out how to get them to sleep before we'd expect any of those things to work.
Well, that's another thing I love about you is I think there is a sequencing to things. And I really appreciate that you're very thoughtful in the way you sequence and flow people through. So we're going to have a link where people can sign up for your webinar, and then they can also do it online if you can't make it to San Diego. And your books are both amazing. I don't know, is the thyroid book still in print? It's very hard to get.
No, it's still in print.
Okay, good.
Yeah, still on Amazon. You can find it there. And with the neuroinflammation course, even if it's going to be on demand after the course, so people can go and take it whenever they like. All the courses will be that way. So once we go through the brain inflammation course, then we have an entire module on the gut. We're going to teach people how to dial the different gut issues. And then the third module this year will be on autoimmunity. So we're going to break down all the newest research and clinical application to autoimmunity. Because I think what we have right now, I think what the feedback I'm getting, so for myself, I've always, worked on trying to develop my own clinical model when I see a patient. And I rewrite my new patient exam and work up like every 3 months because I'm always.
I know, I love that about you.
Yeah, I'm always fine tuning it.
Yeah.
I'm always reading papers because I practice 1 day a week and then I do research 1 day a week, and so I kind of go back and forth. So as I constantly learn new material, I like to try it, and then eventually kind of create a clinical model for myself. And then after I feel comfortable with the clinical model, then I try to share it with people, and then that becomes what I basically teach on. So with neuroinflammation, I think we have a very effective clinical model, but what we face right now is not lack of information. We have too much information. It's how to use the information, and then what are priorities.
Yes, priorities are huge.
And there's no way you would, I think, be able to know what priorities are unless you're actually in clinical practice. That's the difficulty.
I agree.
So like that's what I'm saying. For example, sleep. Like I know as a clinician, if I can't get my patient to sleep, there's nothing that's going to happen with anything else I do if they have brain inflammation. So, but how would you know that unless you were in practice? Because you would see 20 other things and you would just go, well, I don't know what priority is. So having this environment of constantly failing with patients and seeing what works and doesn't work and being able to put the literature together is, I think, a key thing that can create an effective clinical model.
Well, and I think there are a lot of bright, shiny objects, and I think a lot of people that have been sick for a long time have spent a lot of time, energy, and money, and they question themselves. It's hard for them. And so having someone who's been doing this for so long and also is researching at the same time and can just tell them step 1, step 2, step 3, I think that's incredibly valuable.
Yeah, thank you.
So
we're also
really
doing in these Kharrazian Institute courses, we're actually bringing on my own patients that want to share their clinical case. So for this first one, we have 2 patients suffering from glial priming. And there's ups and downs with them and a roller coaster ride. And I want practitioners to really understand that because, it's not all, some patients will have an ongoing challenge because of their physiology. And I don't think some practitioners realize that. I think they feel like, well, I should give them this, this, and this, and I should fix them. And this mindset of fixing them is a model for failure when you work with certain chronic pathophysiology responses. Sometimes it's not about fixing, it's about improving quality of life and maintaining more good days and bad days. So I see a lot of burnout also in people that do functional medicine and nutrition because they think that if a patient doesn't immediately respond with something that they failed, then they don't realize like for that patient, it may be life-changing.
Yeah, our
Well, sometimes,
expectations are maybe,
and
you know,
also sometimes some patients have unrealistic expectations. They may have had a head injury that had completely injured their brain, and they're like, "Well, I want to function like I was when I was 20," and you're like, That's probably not a real clinical outcome.
when
So
even for non-practitioners like moms who are kind of practitioners in their own homes who have, a lot of my daughter's friends play competitive sports and they've had 4 concussions in a row, and they're still functioning. But that's, I worry about them and I want those moms to know what they can do now to kind of unravel. You can't unscramble the egg, but you can maybe set them up for greater success.
right, and another major area of breakthrough with head injuries has been it's not how hard you hit your head, it's how active those microglial cells were before the head injury. So, for example, if someone was a smoker and was anemic and they had a little bit of hypoxia, lack of oxygen going through the brain before the head injury, they would have a significant different impact after the head injury than someone who didn't have anemia and was a smoker, right? So, yeah, they're all
Correct. And I think the earlier that you can address the issue so that you're addressing it when it's still acute before it becomes chronic, I mean, that's been my experience, the better the outcome.
right. So these inflammatory responses are like a forest fire; they just spread. And once they start converting cells to a prime cells, they don't go back, just like hard-boiled eggs. So the sooner people intervene, the better. It's just sometimes hard for people to make that connection. And we didn't know about that. We didn't really know 10 years ago that a head injury would really catch up with someone um,
Yeah,
10 years later, 20 years later, and that they should even think about those things.
that's a
And
great analogy, by the way. I just want to thank you for your time and for sharing your knowledge. And how can people get in touch with you? What's the best way for them to find you, find out more about the course, more
sure.
about your work?
So the Kharrazian Institute, Kharrazian Institute, is where I teach my courses for healthcare professionals. And then I have a website called Dr. K News, drknews.com, Dr. K News, and that's where I put articles on there. I also put together a 6-week program for patients, consumers, people that are not healthcare professionals to kind of guide them through how to improve their own brain health. Each week we teach them different concepts of things they do in their life.
Which is
Um,
good because you've got what, a 2-year waiting list to see you in person?
we have it quite a bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's something that's available. And then I wrote why do I still have why isn't my brain working as a book, and why do I still have thyroid symptoms as a thyroid book that's available on Amazon. So those are all my things.
Yes, and I highly encourage everyone to delve deep into Dr. K's work. It's amazing, and whether you're a clinician or someone who's just tired and has brain fog, or a mom who wants to help her kids with concussions, I really think that what you're doing is just groundbreaking and very preventative. Like I love, maybe if your relative had known you early on, they wouldn't have had to go through a lifetime of suffering. So thank you
Pleasure. Thank
so
you.
much.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jodi Cohen, founder of Vibrant Blue Oils. Thank you so much for watching this YouTube video. Please don't forget to subscribe by clicking the circle at the bottom of this screen. And if you want to access more free essential oil trainings, just visit vibrantblueoils.com/YouTube. You can find this link in the video description. Thank you again.